Hold on. Say that again.
Uh, what I asked you, what if I said the N word while
Well,
we were recording?
that would not be. I'd get my video taken down, and then I couldn't. Then I couldn't complete my series, and I'd be very upset at you.
All
Uh,
right. Well, it's rolling now, so
yeah,
let's
it
get to
is.
it.
All right, everybody. So we're back. We're on the second part now of the sense certainty section. Sorry, yeah, of the sense certainty section of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I mean, I guess you kind of know that by the title. It's kind of pointless. Um, as always, make sure you watch the episode before, or else this isn't going to make any sense. We sort of went through the major stages of the dialectic in this part, and now we're sort of coming to the close here, where Hegel's going to talk about how uh, the unity and multiplicity within appearance is sort of unified in our understanding through force. So, without further ado, I'll just get started. Uh, as consciousness moves away from a sense certainty to perception, it begins to think of the object and is confronted with the qualities of it. These qualities become the being for self of the subject and are the unconditioned universal. That is to say, these universals, whiteness, shape, tartness, become abstract and the notion in consciousness. The notion, meaning substance, is reflected back into consciousness which, through which consciousness makes it its object of knowing, and eventually is supposed to unite back to substance, so that way comprehension and reality are one. However, since at this stage consciousness does not have um, understanding of itself as consciousness, self consciousness, it does not recognize that these universals exist as unconditioned in themselves for consciousness. If it did have understanding of itself as such, then notion would take itself as present or one with the universal it abstracted. For now, consciousness does not understand that these universals are abstractions and takes them as essential in the sense of being real objects within substance outside of the subject. So basically, this is kind of what I was speaking about in the last episode, how there's a very important distinction between in itself and for itself. So the in itself is just the object distinct from consciousness, distinct from the subject. And for itself is that distinct object as it relates to consciousness. Consciousness's experience and understanding of that object, and ultimately its abstraction of it into its mind. Um, so that's important. So, for example, I've been using the example of an apple, so I'm going to stick with that just for continuity's sake. If you have an apple, right? So that apple, its appearance is a specific appearance for you, um, and not only is that appearance for your consciousness, your abstraction of that apple into your mind and your recognition of it as its own distinct object is also for your consciousness. It's a relational sort of category that Hegel's creating there, the being for consciousness. Uh, and
Or being for self is the
yeah,
way
or being
that
for
he
self.
puts it.
Yeah. And
And
see,
actually, he calls this the one-sided extreme of being for self, which is basically his way of saying like it's in your head, bro.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
pretty much.
related to the substance.
And so there's another part in this. Just for context, by the way, every single paragraph you see here is me summarizing every paragraph in that chapter. So the he speaks
And
here.
we'll just trust you to like rightly interpret Hegel's words for
Well,
us,
yeah, I
as you are the
appreciate.
supreme arbiter.
Yeah, well, for context, that is actually a good question because there's a meme. It's like the guy who thinks he understands Hegel. I am cross-referencing every note I take and every thing with pretty much every other source outside of myself I can to make sure I'm as on point as possible. This isn't. I'm not really freeballing it, so to speak, and doing like I'm doing my best, of course, but I'm also like trying to see where if I'm wrong because there's been times where I was wrong and I went back and corrected it. But
Like to be fair to you, like there was that one time when I actually cross-referenced your notes of the original text, and it seemed pretty consistent.
yeah.
That was like more to do with the preface, but here I don't know. Things are a little bit over my head, so I
Well,
don't
the
really
thing
know a
is,
way of checking.
like in the last episode, you pointed out something interesting that I kind of want to comment on. You're like, well, didn't Hegel? You said me, but really, if you're saying me, you also mean Hegel, I guess, because I'm paraphrasing him. Didn't he contradict himself? And if you stopped in the middle of that chapter, yes, he would be contradicting himself, but he's doing that on purpose because he's going to show how it leads to a resolution. So that's why, like, if you for anyone wondering, uh, you're not going to really understand this book unless you read the whole thing because every part is related to every other part in a way. If you stop in the middle of it, it's like stopping in the middle of a workout or something. You're kind of defeating the purpose of it. It's supposed to be there is a whole completion process going on. I guess that really applies to anything though, but in particular this because he is working with contradictions. It's implicit in his philosophy. But the one thing I wanted to point out before in this part is that Hegel was in the last section in perception. He was talking about how the universals went from this unessential abstraction to an essential thing in their existence as being for the object, and now he's saying that they're not that they're an abstraction and consciousness takes them as essential, even though they don't really seem to be. But what he's saying is that to give this more context, he's saying that consciousness doesn't understand that its abstractions are abstractions and not like necessarily they don't exist the same way they exist in abstractions in the concrete world. So redness as such doesn't exist in the concrete world. All you're met with in the concrete world is instances of red here and there. That's kind of what he's getting at. He's saying, but consciousness at this point is taking that abstraction to be just as equally real as its experience of concrete reality, and that's sort of the problem. And it doesn't recognize it as a notion, as a concept. And the reason it doesn't do that is because it hasn't reached the stage of self-consciousness yet, which is going to be the section after sense certainty that we'll obviously get to later on. So I just want to make that clear in case it does seem like it's all over the place and contradicting itself. That's sort of what he's getting at here. So anyways, moving on. Consciousness now takes the object to be a single determinate being in what was referred to as the true. It has moved beyond the attempts to dissolve it into universals and then back into a unity. It accepts the object as oneness, but it has not yet raised it to the level of being for self, or as the object as it is distinct but for consciousness. It raises it or abstracts it as a unity. This unity is unlike sense certainty in that it is not sensed or felt, but a self-relating object of knowing in consciousness. But consciousness does not yet recognize that it exists for it and takes it to be just the object and not the object distinct from and for consciousness. We must now bring the object to consciousness so that we can abstract it as a whole into the notion and then work through it to bring it to a complete understanding. We do this not by diving into its universals and staying there, but rather with the object as it appears for us and how the universals are united to the object. So we now take the object as it is in its unity, which is not the same thing as staying within sense certainty because we've abstracted the object for ourselves. Of course, we don't recognize it as an abstraction for ourselves yet. We're just taking it as, if you were to say to somebody at this point, hey, there's actually a difference between your idea of the apple and the apple itself, of course they would understand that. But like, as we're going through the motions at this point, we don't really realize that we're doing that yet. It's still, it's like almost an unconscious thing, basically. So that's what he's saying there. Consciousness begins to understand. Oh, and also I should clarify, he later says that the way to really understand the object is not to just divide it into its universals, but it's really just to take the object as a whole and start from that starting point. And of course, it's natural to go into its universals, but we want to try to avoid that because it's going to end up bringing us to a place where we can't really get out of yet. And we're going to see how we can avoid that, obviously, in force and understanding. Consciousness begins to understand that the subject has its essence, or being for self, or being for itself, and its content being for another, both of which are inherent to its nature. In its being for self, it is nature of the content of its being to relate either to itself or another, or in being for consciousness, thus relating to consciousness. We ought to remember here that the object is nonetheless still existing as the concept for consciousness. Even if simple object X is taken as such, it still has being for another in the fact that X equals X, as it is relating to itself. This is how we know it is the universal nature, in that even when an object is taken as solely as possible, it still has relational being, even if it is itself to itself. Of course, as X is our concept, it exists in relation to us too. Its essence as our object is to be its own object and relate to ourselves. Hegel goes on to saying that this is its unconditional universal nature. And he means that this is the nature in all objects, and all objects share this nature described. So basically, this is just sort of, if you could say, well, what is the essence of an object? He would say it has a being for itself and a being for another. It has its own independent existence, but it's also inherently relational. And that's the sort of universal nature of all objects that exist. Any quality, I guess, even you could say. Um, since being for another and being for self are inherent to the object and are its universal nature, and because of this, they pass into one another, or as soon as we get an object, we know it as the object, and we know how it relates to itself within the intrinsic properties and without extrinsically. Uh, Now that consciousness recognizes these two distinct aspects of its nature, it must come to know how it is that they can be one, and thus we have the birth of force as a principle by which the object can have its self identity and also have its relational identity within and without. So this is now the introduction of force. Uh, Once the unconditioned universal is conditioned and its concrete existence is always conditioned or attached to some distinct object which is distinct from being for itself as such, what Hegel calls the quote matters, it passes into unity in the object. The qualia, but by the way, for anyone actually reading the text, if they're going along with this, when he uses the term matters, he's really talking about the qualities of the universals of the object are distinct but interpenetrate into the object and become united and conditioned through it. However, this is done through force, which once it is recognized as a thing, as such, it reflects into itself. It is a self identity and is taken as its own universal in its own unity. Um, so consciousness now understands that the unconditioned universal is its own object, which transcends the existence in a conditioned object. However, the unconditioned universal lacks independence, just like the determinate object does, as the essence of the universal is to pass back into a condition formed in the object. It has being for another. The red of the apple is not just red as such, it is also red, which is proper to the apple and necessary for it. This is the passing away of the red's independence. The red cannot exist as some free floating form. Its nature is tied to its conditioned existence in the object. This is just another roundabout way of saying that universals must exist as particulars, because to be a universal is to be that which transcends all particulars. So basically, the particular is sort of exists necessarily for the universal's identity. That's basically what he's saying, but he's relating it to the universal qualities present within objects. Uh, Anyways, moving on. The matters or the universals are found in the unity of the object, and they exist as a multiplicity. But in the fact they are many, the universals are their own unity. But since this unity has proper to its essence the being for another, relational being, which is the being for an object, they therefore pass back into the unity of the object, since the universals are just as much tethered to the object. This is the movement of force, which is always.
Hold on a moment. When he says universals, is that identical with qualities?
Yeah,
Qualia? Right.
exactly. So you'll also see, like, I use this term. I don't know if you were here for this, but like matters. This is a term he uses actually. That's also synonymous with universals and qualia. Just to be
Okay.
clear.
Good to know.
This is the movement of force which is always sublating. Force contains itself in the expression, in the sense that force must be tied to its effect for it to be force, and self-contained, in the sense that it moves beyond any particular expression of itself into the next, but nonetheless tied to the next particular expression. Force, as being for itself, is abstracted from its concrete expression with the objects it is expressed in and through. This expression is the being for another of force, which is inherent to its nature. Force, quote, as such, so to speak, is the unconditioned universal which exists for the understanding, which is a faculty of our consciousness. It is a mistake to think it can exist without its concrete expression, since the expression is what force is. It is not just limited to any individual expression, but always is present within them when it is. It is not the inner being of things because it is moving and uniting them. Force is the process of a unity, but for this process to occur, it requires the precondition of a multiplicity to unify. So this is also why he sort of starts out this section talking about how, like, consciousness doesn't understand that these the objects are for it, for itself, for consciousness. And he's saying here that now consciousness, when it experiences this movement within reality, this sort of unification of unity and multiplicity, it
Where is
begins.
this force coming from?
So the force, well, where it's coming from, that's sort of I guess it's almost a separate question from what he's getting at here. I think he's just sort of like describing consciousness as, so when you exist in the world, right, you're going to be seeing change and movement, and you're going to start seeing how objects are one and many at the same time, uh, or one and many at the same time when you think of them as well. And so you're going to start to understand things like causation, but causation as such doesn't, just like red as such, doesn't exist in the concrete world. It's something consciousness abstracts from it. Aha, now I have an understanding of force, of cause, effect. These things, are, they exist, but they're consciousness takes these things to exist concretely at this point, even though they don't exist as such concretely. They exist tethered to a particular effect, right? So like you can never see force or cause as such. It's always cause tied to some other phenomenon. Like if I'm driving a car into a wall, right, there's force present there, but that's a specific kind of force. If I'm jumping on a trampoline, that's another specific kind of force. It's always in particular form, but it's the abstraction of it is is sort of the work of the understanding to make sense of the world around it. Likewise, if you have
That's
a
actually pretty fascinating when you put it in those kinds of extreme terms, that cause and effect doesn't exist independently in reality. It's only how we
yeah,
interpret it with our minds.
yeah. So and that's basically what he's getting at. He's saying that's an abstraction. He's not like, and I think some people might read this and might see him like, how do I put it? Like looking down on somebody who does that. He's not doing that at all. He's sort of just saying like, no, this is sort of like, this is like the first step to something greater. Like we start from abstracting it, but not realizing it's an abstraction. And then, but we have to realize it's actually tied. Like in its concrete reality, it's not abstract. It's always united to phenomena, um, and the abstraction is the work of us. It's us dividing it in our consciousness so that way we can comprehend it better. Um, but in their concrete existence, there is no division. It's just it is a unity. Which I'm going.
So
Yeah.
if there was a universe without consciousness, it would just be like a maelstrom of things that just don't make sense at all.
See, that's a good question
It would
because
be like like chaotic sort of flux, like pure flux, like the sort of the waters in Genesis before they were given form or light.
yeah. Well, I don't know. Like, can we even like? Are we even? See, I want. Can we even speak? Can we even conceive of a world without consciousness? Because the act of conceiving is like to like it's almost like any talk of a world at all.
Well,
Is
it just reminds me of like the sort of chaotic primordial state of the universe or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah. I
Before
guess
it's
it would be
given form.
disunited, and I mean that's kind of what Bradley gets at, And I don't want to start going into a different philosopher, but that does remind me of like F.H. Bradley. He'll be like, well, ultimately, like these appearances exist for consciousness. They're all self-contradictory, and they can't be reality because of that. And so, reality is something we, in some sense, out of our understanding, even though we can understand some of it. It'd probably be something like that. But I suppose so. I mean, Kant goes into this too. He's saying that like everything is mediated through unity of our perception, but uh, I'm not as good with Kant as I am with Hegel, even though I probably should be. But anyway, so I think we're on the second to last here. In a sense, force has its essence outside of itself, in the sense that force must exist before it expresses itself. So that's kind of confusing, but this took a while to get, but we'll see how this actually ends up making sense. Its expression is nonetheless necessary and requires an other for it to be expressed. When force is reflected back into itself, it can only do as long as it has its effect, so to speak, which is inherent to its expression as force. We see that force must refer to something outside of itself to be force, but nonetheless, this is just what force is. It is the essence. To do this, in order to express itself. This is the work of the understanding coming to know the nature of reciprocity and how for things to have their essence, they must appeal to something outside of itself to derive its essence. So this is ultimately consciousness coming to know being for another, as well as the fact that when we take force, inherent to force is like its essence is to unify things. So if its essence is to unify things, that means its essence is outside of itself. To make it easier to understand, if Gabriel Sprock's essence is to make YouTube videos, it's going to require the existence of YouTube for him to make videos. Uh, you
But
know,
does force really unify things, or does it divide things?
so that's a good question, right? I guess it does both because I guess in the act of unifying things, you are dividing things in a way, right? Because let's say for example, let's just say you have like a bunch of dots, and you like, oh no, here's a better example. You have like a bunch of like um, dots of water on a plate, and then you like, so they're separate and they're distinct from one another, and then you like smush them together so they make one big blob of water. Okay, so in a sense, you did unify them, but you also divided that existence from the prior existence. Those are now two distinct forms of existence. Um, so yeah, I think in any act of unification, division is also implied. I think you'd be correct in that. I suppose Hegel is focused on the unification aspect because that is really what consciousness sort of focuses on when it experiences it. But I don't. I think you're like right in saying that though. And I mean, in a way, I guess he would agree because he would say that like any positive expression is a negation too. In a way, it's a negation of prior conditions.
Well, for me, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the matter at hand, but like whenever I picture Hegel talking about objects, I always imagine these like gray balls, like bumping into each other, because he kind of lived in a Newtonian paradigm of
Yeah,
like billiard balls smashing into each other, and that
yeah.
kind of thing.
And I mean, it is like abstract as well, so that would be like a good way to, I guess, that'd sort of be my first. I guess I have a similar sort of conception of that as well. I'm actually thinking of like yeah, matter or something myself, but and so he's so consciousness at this point understands reciprocity. It understands how something like force, in order for it to exist, it must appeal to something outside of itself. Because if there was nothing outside of force, then force cannot be force over something. It's almost like law, right? Like law has to be like, and I'm speaking in the legal sense of law. Law only makes sense if you have a society in which that law applies. Uh, if it doesn't apply to any society, then it's like it can't really be law at that point. It's not. It's unapplicable. It's lost its essence. So that's sort of what he's getting at. And it's at this point that consciousness truly understands being for another, which is synonymous with reciprocity. It's relational existence. Uh, so force seems to be bifurcated in the sense that there is force which has its essence outside of itself, and that it solicits or requires the objects and their universals to unite. But also there is force which forces force to do this expression, which is where we come to know force as it is in itself. However, the secondary aspect is just force itself, or as such. Perhaps it'll,
Wait, okay, so let's backpedal a little bit here because I'm trying to
yeah,
understand this. So say you got like two balls, one smashes into the other. So like there's the movement in the one ball, it makes
yeah.
contact with the other ball and then moves the other ball. So like I'm struggling to see how the essence of the force isn't within the ball that first moves.
No, it
Rather,
is.
so it's in the other ball.
No, so
Okay.
like what he's saying is force as such has its essence outside of itself. So it does need the balls, basically. So like that's correct. Like the force is tied to that what you're describing, and it can't not be tied to that. Uh and that's why Hegel is saying when we try to abstract it from it, we can do that to make sense of it, but that's the understanding, and that's not how it exists in the concrete reality. How it exists in the concrete reality is just as you described. Um, and that's so where he speaks of its essence as soliciting or appealing to something outside of itself, he's basically describing what you're saying, that like, look, it has to be tied to the ball or whatever. Uh, and if it isn't, then it's not force because its essence is to do that. So
But how is it then justifying itself by something outside of itself?
because there's a distinction between the ball itself and the force moving it.
Hmm.
So that's what he's getting at.
So it is the ball itself, which is the thing outside of itself.
Well, the thing outside of itself, meaning force, yes. When we say outside, it's probably better to say like distinct from it. Uh, like you jumping up and down like that. The force of you jumping up and down is clearly distinct from you as a person. Um, so
Hmm.
and and so we could see that, me jumping up. I mean, that's just force anyway. But me jumping up and down, you jumping up and down. If we're both jumping up and down in the same room like two retards, uh, you know, and so, Hegel's sitting there. He can go, okay, I'm abstracting from this that there's force, and that this force it transcends Snout's jumping up and down and Gabriel's jumping up and down. But that's just an abstraction in my understanding. Even though it makes sense that I would abstract that because I could see it in two distinct instances between two distinct objects. But ultimately, that we have to understand that abstraction is coming from a concrete reality where the two aren't disunited; they're together. But he's also saying that force in particular has that solicitation outside of itself. It's ultimately a relational thing. Another way of putting it is also like cause isn't cause unless it has an effect, right? Uh, by definition,
So
you
is
can't.
force a universal?
Yes, yeah, it is.
It's a
Um,
quality
yeah, it's a quality.
property.
Yeah, and so that's what he's getting at. And of course, the in itself or the like force as such is a abstracted universal,
Hmm.
basically. Ah,
So is force the underpinning of every single other quality like redness or saltiness?
well, he I think that's well, you'll see that because he's going to start talking about later on how from force we get law, where we try to divide force into different kinds of forces, but then consciousness then realizes that there's actually something underlying all of these laws, which is like flux, and then we get a notion of flux, which is some sort of higher notion of force, and then we get a notion of infinity, and then we get the true infinity, and that's where we get the first understanding of negativity. But I don't
Well,
want to.
I suppose like force kind of makes sense because I mean calling it force makes sense because if you look at like obviously like this wasn't really an understanding of physics back in Hegel's day, I don't think.
Yeah,
But like their understanding of physics wasn't as advanced as ours is today. But like in terms of like the molecular, the understanding of molecular structure and so on and so forth. But
yeah,
uh, like what are molecules? They're things, they're atoms that are bound together by these sort of bonds, like these bonds of electrons, and that is a kind of force,
yeah,
right? So they're forced into an arrangement where they constitute a particular
yeah.
element.
And that's sort of what he's getting at, and you just see this just in general, like even like the succession of time or it's like succession of movements is a kind of force, at least for consciousness. But well, I'm just going to continue this paragraph because it's going to sort of the first sort of half of this last paragraph here is really abstract, but the second half should sort of clarify it. Uh, so perhaps in a way we can say that this is the being for another of force, in that force must, quote, like force itself or solicit itself to force the universals and objects together. The being for another is really for itself. Not only does force need its objects to work through, it also needs to have inherent to itself the nature of soliciting. So even when we try to take force as unmediated or unconditioned, which is just the same as saying as such, we can see that inherent to it is its movement to solicit or its uh, referential nature to something outside of itself. So basically, he's just saying when like they're soliciting in the sense of like, okay, we're going to appeal to the other objects so that way we can be force. But then there's also just like the fact that force itself, as its essence, is to like reach out and solicit, or to reach outside of itself, and it basically makes itself do that, so to speak. Now,
When you say solicit, that makes me think of prostitution.
yeah, like that. That's exactly what I was thinking when I read this, like, or like a bum on the side of the street, just like haggling somebody for change. And like you could say the essence of the bum is to basically harass people. And if you were to take the bum as such, like you were to take his essence. Well, what is the essence? It is to basically move outside of itself and grab hold of the other. And that's what he's saying with force is what force is. So but you can bifurcate that in a way. He's saying because you can say, well, part of it is to unite to the object, but also part of it is like this sort of universal movement to constantly need to unite for its identity. Even though in reality it's all unified, it's all one thing, but that's how the understanding divides it. Uh,
Mm.
so continuing on with that, the two forces, which are really the one essence of force, like I just said, find their necessity in one another. The first force needs the second to solicit, to then force universals and objects together. And likewise, the second force requires this solicitation of itself in order to act as force or to unite things together. The reason the first force is necessary is because inherent to the essence of force is the movement of unification, and this can only occur if force itself has some unity within itself and as its essence, which is force. One may ask if the need of the first force for the second to have its essence would entail an infinite regress. But this is the wrong way of looking at it because Hegel is not making a temporal or accidental claim. Rather, he is saying that these two forces need one another to have their essence. The first aspect of force is the act of solicitation itself, the need of force to solicit as such, to have its essence. And the second aspect is just a solicitation toward the object, extended beyond itself. The distinction presented is real for the understanding, but when force appears as it is a unity, it expresses itself as such as a unity. So the reason I like sort of put that in there, like I'm reading that into the paragraph a little bit because I was like a little bamboozled there because I'm like, well, why do I need this first? The first aspect almost seems superfluous, right? Because if the essence of force is to solicit, well, clearly you can only solicit in one way toward the object. So why do I need that? But I think what Hegel's trying to say is that, well, there's sort of a twofold aspect. Yes, there's one aspect where it has to extend beyond itself. That's part of its essence. But then there's the other aspect where it has just sort of the act of moving outside, like inherent to it. So there's the actual act of unifying things, and then there's the act of like having to extend, go beyond itself, basically. And that's sort of this weird, sort of very like subtle, but I guess important distinction he's making. And they both require one another because, of course, in order to go beyond yourself, you need to have the essence of going beyond yourself to do that. Um,
So, uh, so it's ball one and ball two basically. Ball two is beyond itself, right?
well, I guess you could put it that way. Um, but like
If
so
you were
it,
dumb like me.
well, it's the reason I wanted to avoid like implying other object is because I just feel like it could get hazy a little bit. But like I'm trying to maybe I'm going to use the bum example again. Okay, so if you or we'll use a prostitute. That's a funnier example. So
Mm.
obviously, like the essence of the prostitute is to solicit, um, and in order for the prostitute to solicit, it has to go beyond itself. It has to reach out, but before it can reach out, it has to have within itself the sort of desire or the expression of needing to reach out to begin with. So there's the act of reaching out, and then there's like uh reaching out itself as being inherent to it, I guess is what he's getting at. So I suppose there's a difference between the act of unifying and the act of the uh the essence itself having to unify for its identity, I guess.
When you talk about prostitution, what do you mean by unify? What are
Well,
we unifying?
well, clearly, if a prostitute solicits a man on the street, they're going to unify in a bedroom in a grotesque way.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay, good to know. I just needed to clarify that for the audience.
and but the prostitute herself, though, like within her, she has this sort of desire to go beyond herself. but the desire to go beyond herself is distinct from the desire, or rather from the act of going beyond herself. So if you personify it, it makes a lot of sense. But to sort of reiterate, the act of unifying itself, which is proper to the essence, is also distinct from the act of having to uh, go beyond yourself. So I guess, yeah, I guess what is the difference of necessity and act, so to speak, if we want to make it as abstract as possible. Uh, the
Wait,
for,
so like, what would be the concrete example of unifying versus going beyond?
so the concrete. Well, this is what he was saying before. In the concrete expression, um, that distinction dissolves. It doesn't exist. You only just have uh, the movement of objects, which which force is guiding. But that distinction that he's talking about, that only exists for us when we start to try to understand it and divide it into our mind, right? Because we're able to say, well, force wants to appeal to things outside of itself, and and then there's also the distinction where force wants to unite those things to do that. Uh, so that's sort of what he's trying to get at there.
But it
That's
goes against eventually it goes against the limit, right?
what
To
what
to
limit?
what it can do. Like, that there's a limit to what any one object can go
Oh yeah,
beyond,
of course.
right?
Yeah, yeah. You can't like at a certain point you can't like do anything. The object can't be like identical to something other than itself. It can't contradict itself. Of course, there's limit to this. Definitely. Um, so
Otherwise, it would be some kind of like apocalyptic thing where everything gets absorbed by one,
yeah,
like
and then even in that, you could
just
say
gets
that.
destroyed and amalgamated into this
Yeah,
like unit, like ultimate unity. But obviously, we don't live in that world, right? So
right. And even that, I guess you could almost argue is itself a higher force destroying the lower forces in a way. If you wanted to do that, I guess you could. But anyway, the form of force is the soliciting and the solicited. So that he's basically going back into this. The dual aspect, once again, of the first force, which is soliciting for itself, whereas the second is the solicited, is the externalization of force toward the object that is inherent to it. The content is universal, and the objects which are unified by force uh, are passive. However, this distinction is only within the understanding and concrete existence. In concrete existence, force and its object appear as one with another and never separated. The for itself is the soliciting aspect of the form of force. It is really the need of force to refer to something outside of itself for its essence. It's the aspect of needing to externalize, whereas the second movement towards the object instead of just a need of for the movement itself for its essence. Well, let me just hold. Let me maybe I think I like butchered that for a second. Whereas the second movement is the movement toward the object instead. I see. I messed it up. But basically, one is the need to externalize, and the second is just the externalization itself that's inherent to it. That's really the difference. I don't know. This is like I had a stroke here, I guess, when I wrote the last sentence. Uh, since force's essence is to unite the object and its universals, trying to understand force as this abstracted in itself really is not the same thing as what force really is, since the essence of force is inherently tied to its expression in substance. The reflection of force into itself or abstract form is really not what it is in actuality, which is just concrete existence. We know that force has its existence in soliciting and solicited, the act of needing to refer to something outside of itself for its existence, and the act of unifying the object and its universals. Both of these need one another. Force is not force unless it is tied to its effects, and likewise its inherent nature of movement itself, which creates its effects. The two aspects pass into one another. Soliciting must be oriented toward that which is moved or solicited for it to be force, and the solicited is only solicited or externalized insofar as it shares the nature of needing to go beyond itself for its own existence, which is the nature of soliciting. The soliciting only makes sense as an aspect if it is there for the solicited, which is the concrete expression of the soliciting. And the solicited needs the inherent nature of movement in order to unify the object. Basically, what I've just been saying for the last 10 minutes, I guess. Uh, Force appears as a concrete expression in the world where its essence in itself is not known directly as it is tied to phenomena. The movement in phenomena is itself a universal, the conditioned expression of force, whereas the second is the force as a universal existence beyond all phenomena, as law, yet still tied to phenomenon, as its essence is outside of itself. This second universal is the abstracted notional form of force in itself. Hegel says this view is more true because it shows how force exists as a thing distinct from the individual expressions and has its own existence as universal, of course, still necessarily tied to those expressions for its essence. Hegel says that force in the first universal is force drawn back into itself, whereas in the second, it's the inner existence of itself. The first is the movement of force through its expressions in substance, which is its own concrete expression, and the second is, quote, force as such, which is an object for the understanding. In the first, we see its evanescent nature present in the movement through substance, and not yet how we abstracted it as a thing in itself. We just know it through its existence in substance. But in the second, when it is elevated to universality, we can see it for itself, but nonetheless inherently related to the world of substance. Consciousness in its knowledge of the universals or qualia in the object and the role which force plays in unifying, it takes itself to now understand the underlying reality of appearance. It understands the present within the object is the totality, or that object is the totality in concrete form. Its universal is immanently present within it. It is determined in this. Consciousness doesn't yet realize that this exists for the understanding, and it has abstracted this from appearance and reflected it back into itself for itself. It takes this to be the concrete existence itself when it exists for the understanding, as the universal which is present with its expression in phenomena. At this point, consciousness has not yet understood the role of reflection of the universal into itself in the understanding. It's not false that these universals exist, it's just false to see them as existing as something totally separate from their expression, which is necessary for them. Consciousness, now that it is acquainted with the universal and its relation to force in the understanding, and now that it sees itself to be able to see into the nature of things, it posits a notion of a supersensuous world outside of itself as its own reality. The supersensuous world, this world is distinguished from the sensuous, which is a world of flux, and the understanding has taken itself to have abstracted the essence of the sensuous, but taken this abstraction as the true. So here's also another key thing we need to touch on. At this point, the understanding now sort of gets like an understanding of a universal world outside of itself. Um, and it's sort of, at this point, it doesn't fully understand its essence as evanescent. It kind of just has like, it's like a picture thought, really. At this point.
What's evanescent? Because you really like using that word.
Well, evanescent is just, it's it's just movement, like negativity. It's another one of those words. Vanishing. Um, Flux, I guess. It's
How can you see into
yeah,
my eyes?
yeah. That's yeah, I like to use that word because he used that word, and like you, I thought, oh, the band, and then I was like, I looked it up, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's actually what it means. Okay, well, I felt like a stupid idiot
You mean
actually.
you got it from the band as well?
Yeah, I mean that's how
Evanescent.
that's my first encounter with that word is, from that song in Halo edits
Wake
back,
me up.
yeah,
Yeah.
back in the day,
Wake
and
me up inside. Anyway,
but so basically, yeah, consciousness now has an understanding of an outside world that has its own laws and such. And this is different from this is not the same thing as sense like immediacy or sense certainty, because it isn't just like just sensing this world of flux. It's now almost it's a more abstract sort of there is this world that I can talk about that's outside of myself that has these laws or that has force within it. And I can tell you things about force and I can talk about universals, and he calls this the super sensible world. Uh, so that's an important thing to take note of here because it's going to come up later in the following sections.
the super sensible world. That sounds
Yeah,
promising.
you say it sounds Protestant.
No, promising.
Oh, okay. I don't know why I
It's
misheard it.
intriguing.
Sorry, my hearing is like gone today because I'm still like kind of sick and I had like vertigo all day. It's weird.
Oh,
And I'm driving around like I'm drunk even though I'm not. But
you're
anyway.
driving around right now?
No, I'm not. That would be horrible. I couldn't drive around and read Hegel notes to you. That's like torture. Uh anyway, Moving
It's like
on.
drinking and driving.
Yeah. Well, worse maybe because you'd be even more distracted trying to be precise on this, then you'd crash. Uh, you know, when I drink and drive, I'm a lot better. That's a joke. Don't do that. I would never drink and drive ever. Anyway, uh, it sees that with the syllogism as its. Oh wait, did I? No, yeah, I read the last one. It sees that with syllogism as its middle term, it can navigate its way between the supersensuous world and itself. The object for Hegel is the syllogism, which is the concrete expression of this attempt of consciousness to navigate through the supersensuous world, the world which has a beyond outside of consciousness with its own nature, which consciousness is confident that it knows. At this point, consciousness does not yet understand that its navigation is a navigation not through the supersensuous world in itself, but rather a navigation through its own notion of such. It posits the supersensuous world beyond its mere movement in the quote nows, but as a whole, reality in itself which it can know. This is the birth of optimism in consciousness of its own understanding. So basically what I was just saying before, consciousness now has like this sort of confidence. It's saying, oh, I can talk about the world outside of myself. I can tell you true things about it. I know it. I know it's universal. I know about force. But it doesn't know that these are all the abstractions it's made for itself. It's sort of, it's like sniffing its own farts, so to speak. Um, it's boasting. It has this sort of confidence, but it's a little bit unearned at this point, basically. And when he talks about the middle term, the syllogism, basically he's saying, consciousness uses linguistic phrases to sort of navigate itself through its the world outside of itself. It understands the world through linguistic structures, basically. And that's kind of how the notion takes form. It comes as a picture and in a sort of series of sentences that refer to the world of substance, but are ultimately
When you take rock and you smash it into other rock, you get sharper rock.
basically, yeah. But then that just gets more and more complex to where you start talking about things like being for itself or something, uh, and that itself is a syllogism of consciousness trying to um,
But like on a more serious note, like what I was saying has to do with like maybe like there's a historical dimension to this, like maybe Hegel's in the phenomenology spirit, which is like the process of consciousness. Maybe he's also talking about like human history and the development of
yeah,
human
no,
society and technology.
you're correct. And like not only is that like a good inference to make, that's like that'll later become explicit because there's sections in this book titled religion. So he starts talking about like how religion relates to consciousness as like a civilizational thing. And it seems crazy. Like, how could this guy go from talking about like universals and objects and trees and like paper to like God? Like but he does manage to pull it off in a coherent way. That's why I almost said this reminds me of like natural theology in the way that like Thomas Aquinas like reasoned back to God through like causation. He's building up to like a higher plane of existence from the most uh,
Hmm.
basic plane of existence or the most immediate plane of existence. It's a very similar sort of thing. Uh, so
Except Hegel wasn't a scholastic.
no, but he was trained in theology before he was doing this. I'm pretty sure, but he
I
was
think you at one point he was like a Protestant seminarian.
yeah. Well, yeah, he was. I think he was Lutheran, which is
Yeah.
so Protestant. But uh, okay, we're making good progress. We only got like 5 pages left. I mean,
Oh, we're on 15 right now.
well, we're on 14. There's 19 pages.
Ah,
So
right. Okay.
uh, consciousness may have an understanding of a supersensible world which it takes as an in itself and not yet for itself. But at this stage, it has no understanding of its inner world. It still lacks self consciousness. It does not yet understand that its notions are for itself. It takes them to be in itself and not notional, and that this supersensible world is an appearance for consciousness. It doesn't understand its own inner wealth because it lacks self consciousness. At this stage, consciousness, in its lack of self knowing, sees the inner world as a mere unapproachable beyond, and the supersensible world as the only thing that can be known. It does not yet understand its notional reality and the fact that one becomes self conscious when they relate notion to reality. because notion is proper to consciousness. The inner world for consciousness is still a void because its reality hasn't been made explicit yet.
Well, this reminds me of like the pre-axial age, like mentality or something you know the concept of bicameral mind.
Yeah, that at one point, like people just didn't have like a sense of self, and they were just sort of operating on instinct. And
Yeah, like people didn't question the thoughts that came into their head, which they assumed was from the gods. So they
yeah,
simply acted out whatever came into their head, and they didn't really. So like the unification of consciousness into one thing came during the axial age, or at least that's like the theory of the bicameral mind, which
is
is
that at all related to generative anthropology?
well, generative anthropology has to do with how language originated, which is much further back. So I think that's like a
Yeah,
distinct thing. But
yeah,
uh, yeah, I forgot like who like what kind of academic guy did the whole bicameral mind stuff, but it just reminded me of that, like the development of human consciousness throughout
yeah.
history, and how in the axial age you have the developing notions of like a conscience and self-examination.
Yeah, and I think that would be compatible with this. I think also this would be compatible just with like an individual person, right? Like even like a toddler clearly doesn't have a sense of self consciousness like you or I have, because they haven't had that time to develop that yet. Uh, they might say I want, but that's it's not really like they haven't sat there and thought about what is the I, you know, uh,
Hmm.
and they don't have an understanding of like, oh, I have like this. They might like sort of intuit that they have like an eye that's sort of that stays the same throughout time, but they don't like they haven't raised that to an explicit level in their
Yeah, stupid toddlers.
yeah, they haven't reached self-consciousness yet. Basically all toddlers you'll see are in this sense. And I don't want to get taken off YouTube, but certain groups of people are still in this sense of not having self-consciousness. And I'm sure if you're watching this channel, you probably know all about that. Anyway,
Getting red pilled on Instagram Reels.
yeah, exactly. Uh, the super sensible world, which has its existence for us as our universal, still taken to be the true, is the product of the sensuous and perception, what we call appearance. The essence of the super sensible world is appearance. It is the filling, so to speak. The truth or the essence of this world is mediated through sense and perception, when it is taken as an in itself or having its own reality. It is so on the basis of this mediated of the sensuous and perception, which is how appearance is for us, what is then called the supersensible, taken as the true and actual. Hegel says it is a mistake to view the supersensible world or supersensible as the world as it is for sense certainty or perception, because these shapes, by shapes he means shapes of consciousness, are honed in on particularity, whereas the supersensible is the elevation of appearance as some kind of universal with its own essence beyond consciousness, not a mere fleeting world of sense or some mere abstraction of an object, but rather the world of objects and appearance in which we perceive. This is a crucial distinction. I kind of said that before, but see a lot of things you'll notice, or really, I guess anybody watching this will notice. I will clarify things, and then paragraphs that I've written later will also just reiterate what I clarified. But whatever, that's fine. Nothing wrong with saying the same thing twice. It's how you learn. Anyway, the understanding.
Objects. So objects and appearance. The
Yeah.
world of objects and appearance. But isn't that just the world we live in?
So it's the world we live in, but what he's saying is that there's a difference between like conscious, like consciousness is sort of like experience of that in like an infinite series of nows that are like divisible, and consciousness is understanding of it as like, oh, the world is like this. Does that like make sense? Like there's like a so for example, like you going through your day, like experiencing the world around you is distinct from your conception of an outside world. That's what he's getting at. The latter is an
But that
abstracted.
is your conception of an outside world, is the way you uh like the way you think about it is your
Right,
conception.
right, but like
Whereas I suppose like you meant your experience of the outside world.
yeah, sorry, yeah, maybe I misspoke. But like for example, like
Yeah.
okay, what's today's date? It's Wednesday, March 18th. 2026. Okay, so you went through all day experiencing today, but like
St.
you,
Patrick's Day.
uh, is it? I thought it was yesterday, but
I think it's today.
well, I don't know. Maybe it's different over there in merry old England because over here yesterday everyone was getting shit faced for it. Not me though.
Oh, okay. It was yesterday. Never mind.
But what I'm saying is, so like you and I are looking around our rooms right now. That's our experience. That's different from like, oh yeah, this world that I've lived in since I was 1 years old. Like that whole world that I'm positing is the conception. That's the super sensible world uh, that he's speaking of. It's this retrospective sort of concept of an outside world that we can always go to and talk about and predicate things of, etc.
Yeah, so as you go through life, like that super sensible world gets built up, but obviously that's
Yes.
gone.
Yes.
Obviously, it's like our idea of history. Even though, like we talked about this in the last episode, how history doesn't really exist as such.
Yeah.
It's
Exactly. Like
we
history.
experience it through the present, really, but I mean, but it's also, well, it's real in a super sensible sense, in the sense that like we imagine these events to have taken place, and they probably did.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. It's real in the sense that like I could point to it, but in my pointing to it, I'm pointing to a conception, an abstraction, not a concrete reality. Even though at one point the events that I'm pointing to were concrete, they really no longer are in a certain way because they don't exist. Uh, so that's that's a good way of putting it. Uh, where was I? Well, the second to last year. The understanding in its knowledge of force having the nature of soliciting and solicited, which is the need for it to refer to something outside of itself, the first aspect, and the actual externalization itself, which is the second aspect. That's the bifurcation coming in again. Uh, However, the understanding sees that since this universal has its essence always present in the supersensible world, and that the distinction is in force, they collapse in its concrete expression. It now begins to understand force as law, as the law governing the movement of the supersensible world. It is, in fact, the supersensible world as the world of law, and this law is itself taken to be a sort of unity and unchanging, and in itself the arbiter of change. So this is like when you start getting to physics, right? Like you have force as such, but then physics starts saying, there's gravity, I mean, I'm not really good at physics. I can't like name a bunch of forces for you, but there's plenty of them that you can look into. Uh, so that's now consciousness is it's recognizing the different kinds of forces in existence. It's
I
talking
guess
about,
it's like potentiality and our
yeah,
stuff.
sure, it's like that, but then like it specifies it even more to where you could talk about whatever, like certain kinds of mathematical laws of force, and these are laws now, basically, um, physical laws. That is. Uh, so he refers to this right here as the tranquil kingdom, and I'm going to get into what that is.
Ooh.
The tranquil kingdom is the supersensible world of law. So, just to put that into perspective, the supersensible world, that sort of world that we've abstracted for ourselves, that we can predicate things of, now gets, as you said before, correctly so, built up, and now we're applying law. These laws, well, I'll just continue reading. It is a world that underlies the essence of flux. These laws that guide flux become the universal for the inner world of the understanding. Flux itself, as a principle, becomes a self-same reposed image for consciousness. This is referred to as the tranquil kingdom because it is the understanding elevating appearances to universality, but in so doing, it creates these images of law, which, even though are in essence moving, are taken as self-same static images, resting in tranquility as the object for the understanding, objects which are the underlying essence of appearance. So basically, these laws, like gravity, right? Gravity itself is taken as an abstract thing, which is a law that's underlying all its instances, and it's tranquil. It's unchanging.
I,
Gravity.
I like how Hegel like throws in like these little like seeds that like sow doubt in your mind that force you to go deeper
Yeah. Well, that's
and
exactly what I'm saying.
deconstruct like whatever stage you're at and go somewhere else, and then it's like this endless process.
He does lead you on. I mean, and that's sort of why you can't just stop in the middle of it
Well,
because
it's not. I wouldn't say I like it. I hate it, but in a
yeah,
way that's like like he forces you to work,
yeah,
forces you to think.
yeah. That's why like Well, so that, like that's the thing. That's why I can't stop doing it because I'm like kind of a stubborn bastard myself, and I'm just like I'm not gonna stop until I get all this. Like I would. This is my second time reading this book. I read it for the first time last year, and I got the gist of it. But I'm like, I think there's probably a lot more to know, and I don't want to like waste my time, so I'm coming back again. So here we are. Anyway, uh, since appearance is still an in itself for consciousness and not yet understood as for consciousness, likewise, so is law. Law, which exists in a plethora, has a negativity or difference attached to it, but nonetheless, the understanding seeks to unify law as a single law or law as such. Hegel takes issue with this because law as such does not really explain what law is, as law always has its essence by virtue of being the law of something outside of itself. Even if we take the law of gravity or the law that moves the celestial bodies, it is always understood in relation to its terms that it is law over. Law as such is the attempt at a universal unity of law, points to something indeterminate that we cannot speak of as an in itself or even a for itself. The laws are really only useful as they help us understand the independence of sensuousness. The underlying, or sorry, the understanding now reaches a point where it goes beyond the various laws to law as such, which is present beyond all laws. But even here, once law as such, which is manifest in the sensuous world, becomes notion, it is law turned against itself. Turned against itself because it becomes a notion for consciousness, which is distinct from its concrete expression as the law of laws. Consciousness still takes this as law in itself, not for consciousness. All the laws to be elevated to the universal must be grasped in their unity, and likewise, once the law as such is grasped in its unity and becomes a notion for consciousness, it is no longer the law as it is expressed concretely, but its universal notion which exists as a unity for consciousness. So, I actually should have probably analyzed this paragraph here a
Yeah,
little
you
bit.
kind of lost me.
Yeah. So, uh, basically, he's saying, even like the tranquil kingdom of laws itself, uh, the law, I'll just say with the law of gravity. Of course, the law of gravity, much like force as such, has its essence outside of itself. Gravity is only gravity insofar as there's objects which have a sort of drawnness to each other. Um, and later on,
So it's conditional.
yeah, it's basically yeah, it's not it has contingency upon something outside of itself. Its essence is dependent. Uh, he later on says here, law as such is the attempt at a universal unity of law. Wait, law as
But
such,
hold on, but gravity is always present, but like it can be counteracted, of course, right?
sure,
Like with a
but like,
rocket.
yeah, it can be counteracted, but like it still exists. It's still a law.
So
Uh,
it's not really conditional then, is it?
well,
If
that
it
what did I?
always exists,
Yeah, it always exists.
no matter what.
Well, when I say conditional, what I'm saying is that like it's like its condition exists on like it's related to its terms. It doesn't exist as like a it doesn't have like necessary logical existence or something. That's kind and he's going to talk about that too. Conscious will start to treat it like that. Science will do that, and then science basically also kind of like begins to really
Is
pump.
there anything that has necessary logical existence?
Yeah, the law of identity.
Hmm.
You know, um,
But
that
how is that not like uh being for what does he call it? Like being outside of itself or whatever.
okay. So it is relational though. So in a way,
Yeah.
yes, it is self relating. I mean, and all qualities are, and that's going to become you know
So
uh
even the laws of logic are not fixed for Hegel.
well they're fixed but they're relational.
Yeah, but like if it's relational, then that means like they're not absolute.
Well, what depends what you mean by absolute. Like they can be undone, not necessarily, because
Well, they're contingent, right?
well, see that's the thing with like the laws of logic, right? Because the laws of logic would be like almost in a sense contingent upon themselves, which is weird, which I guess would be necessary because if you try to undo the laws of logic, you would have to presuppose them, right? And you can't, but you
I
can't.
guess to understand this, we'd have to read the whole science of logic.
Sure, but also
which
like
is another book.
yeah, which yeah, we're gonna do that in 2027. So you know, stay ready. I'm quitting my
Yes.
job just to work through. I have it right here on my desk, and it's even bigger than the phenomenology. It's like I don't even want
Well,
to look at it. It's giving me a stomach ache. Uh, but well, yeah, all laws are everything. Like anything that exists in reality really is relational if you think about it, and that's what Bradley talks about. F.H. Bradley, the British idealist, who came much later than Hegel, and he's like, well, actually, because they're relational, there's like a disunity. We can't say any of these things really exist. I'm not going to get into that. I will get into that one day, but not now. We'll have to have pessimistic idealism talk because that's his specialty. If he doesn't fucking flake on us again. Um,
yes,
so,
yes.
and I know he's
He
listening to this, and I
is.
know, anyway.
Mm.
Uh, but anyways, let me just clarify this last section here. A law as such is the attempt at a universal unity of law. Uh, Poise is something indeterminate that we cannot speak of as an in itself or even as a for itself. And that's because the laws are really only they really only make sense when they're appeal to something outside of themselves. So law as such, uh, it's not really the most useful tool because it would have to what is it appealing to exactly? Is it
So the
appealing?
laws represent the supersensible world, and
Yeah.
they also help us understand the independence of sensuousness, which is also obviously the sensible world. Right?
Yes. But he's also saying that like we have all these laws, right, that are like disunited, and so we're going to try to say, okay, well, you know what? There's one higher law that's unifying them, and that's law as such, or whatever. But that's a problem because,
He
you know,
doesn't believe in that.
no, because he's saying that like law as such, law always has its essence outside of itself. But like if law is appealing to law, then it doesn't actually have its essence outside of itself at that point. It's self-referential, so it doesn't really like it doesn't help us understand.
Just
Uh,
like the law of identity is self-referential.
yes, exactly. Um, but and he's saying, well, like the purpose of law is to have its identity, have its connection to something that's being moved, whereas the laws themselves aren't being moved; they're static, basically. So why would I, you know, you could categorize them, I guess. You could abstract the universal out of it, but then it wouldn't be the same as law. It would just be saying, there is law, but law as such, as a law, wouldn't be the same thing as those laws because law is always tied to something in the evanescent world, so to speak. It's always appealing to things within existence that are being unified and destroyed, etc. So, and how can that appeal to tranquil, as he refers to the tranquil kingdom, the unmoving world of law? Uh, so,
He doesn't believe the tranquil kingdom exists.
well, it's problematic. It's a lower resolution of
Ah, so he's doing it in like disparaging, like sardonic, mocking tone.
well, he's saying, well, like the tranquil kingdom, right? It's another example of like dropping a breadcrumb. He's like, well, yeah. So now we're at the tranquil kingdom. This is where we've elevated ourselves to. But wait a second, that's also wrong. Even though it
He
kind of
makes
makes,
it sound so nice. It's like some place you want to live.
I know, and it's very poetic, right? That's the one thing about
Yeah.
Hegel. He is kind of a poet too, in many ways. It's like I was like, yeah, you know, I really do like the term tranquil kingdom. When I first came across it, it like caught me. Um, so
I wonder what that is in the original German.
yeah, I'd have to look into that. But so,
It's
like, yeah, I mean, just even if we break this down like a little bit slower, law as such is the attempt at a universal unity of law, as an attempt uh, at a universal unity of law, points to something indeterminate that we cannot speak of as an in itself, and therefore also as a for itself, because you know, anytime we point to law, it's gravity, it's magnetism, it's whatever. There's nothing under there that we can abstract from that. Um, really, because it's all qualified and specific, and that's sort of what he's getting at. You could like categorize them, I guess, but like it still doesn't really work the same way. It's still not law like those are laws. Uh, so uh, anyway, and I did read this paragraph, but I'll just read it again because we might as well. The understanding now reaches a point where it goes beyond the various laws to law as such, which is present beyond all laws. So by the way, like I know this sounds like I just contradicted myself, but he's saying, yeah, consciousness is doing something kind of retarded. It's it's going for law as such, but it's like it doesn't really make sense. Why is it doing that? But it doesn't know better yet. Uh, but even here, once law as such, which is manifest in the sensuous world, becomes notion, it is law turned against itself. Turned against itself because it becomes a notion for consciousness, which is distinct from its concrete expression as the law of laws. Consciousness still takes this as law in itself, not for consciousness. All the laws to be elevated to the universal must be grasped in their unity, and likewise, once the law as such is grasped in its unity and becomes a notion for consciousness, it is no longer the law as it is expressed concretely, but its universal notion which exists only as a unity for consciousness. So this is where it gets even more abstract here. So once we sort of like, of course, consciousness doesn't really recognize this yet, but once it takes law as such, um, that is already a notion because it doesn't exist in the concrete world like the other laws do. Uh, it's like a fake, it's like a faux law in a way. Like there is no law as such, even though we're just really using it as a category at this point, even though the category doesn't really apply because laws are always applying to the super sensible world or the moving world, whereas law as such isn't. Um, but
This
even
makes
here,
Hegel sound kind of evil.
this makes what sound kind of evil?
This makes Hegel sound evil.
Why? Oh, because it's like he's just like denying law. That's kind of funny. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even the terms which law, so this is important here. Even the terms which law is law over are themselves independent in that they are distinct from the law itself. Hegel uses the example of, oh, sorry, I didn't even, well, I went all the way down here, but I
Huh.
will, yeah, I will address that actually. Uh, but this is what I wanted to get at. Turned against itself because it becomes a notion for consciousness. So what does it mean to be turned against itself? That's kind of what I'm getting at here. It's turned against itself because it's saying it's something that it isn't. Uh, in a way, I guess we are like consciousness is trying to.
Whoever has to say I am the king is not really the king.
In a way, yes, that's a way of putting it. But like, so for example, like consciousness is trying to say that like the laws of the physical world are like the same as the laws of logic in a way. Even though the laws of logic apply to the physical world, of course, they're not the same thing. And so we're treating like the law of gravity as the way we would treat like a logical law of necessity. Like the law of non-contradiction is a law of necessity. Like this has to be true. It can't be any other way. And we're making consciousness is sort of making a category error at this point. It's saying that well, the law of gravity is the law of gravity, so it's necessarily true. It's like that's not the same thing though, because you're just saying it has self same identity, and it is itself. Yeah, of course, but that's not the same thing as saying it's necessarily true or that it has to exist. And clearly, we know the law of gravity doesn't have to exist. So, uh,
Hmm.
so that's kind of what he's getting at. Consciousness is equating these physical law as such, with logical law. It's two different games. Uh, so
Well, if I mean, if you were to say that like it's not, it is necessary for everything else to exist or something, then you'd be basically be equating gravity to God, right?
yeah, exactly. That's another good way of putting it. Like it's like equating physics to metaphysics almost, which are two very different things, right? You know,
Mm.
you're saying that well, these things like or it would be like this, right? Like okay, snout is not the same thing as saying snout exists necessarily. Those are two very different claims of a one is of a higher order, one is of a lower order of logic. Yes, you are yourself. You couldn't be anything else but yourself. But that doesn't mean you have to exist. So consciousness is treating laws like that. It's sort of giving them a higher status than it really should. Uh, so yes, I'm just looking over
It's
the
a megalomania.
Yeah, it's so that like you could just see that he's getting very meta, so to speak here. All the laws to be elevated to the universal must be grasped in their unity, of course, and likewise was the law as such is grasped in its unity and becomes a notion for consciousness. It is no longer the law as it is expressed concretely, but it is universal notion which exists as a unity for consciousness. So yeah, that's again, it's a pure abstraction. You could say, oh well, I know the law of gravity exists because there's this thing, gravity, and that exists again across many instances. Um, but law as such, uniting all those laws, you can't really say that in a way. And so it's like that's a different category. You can categorize it, but that's not the same thing as law. It's not something that's binding them together that transcends all of them. That's where law becomes a sort of faux law, a law turned against itself. It's just a pure abstraction for consciousness to sort of make this more comprehensible for itself. Uh, so that's sort of what he's getting at there. But I'm going to move on to these last two paragraphs here. Present within all laws is distinction, but because the laws are unities, there is always unity present in law. When elevated to the universal, all the differences are collapsed within the notional unity itself, although not yet realized as notional. Furthermore, when necessity is spoken of in law, the term is lacking in meaning because the law has nothing about itself that is necessary, only in the sense that it is necessary, that it is necessarily itself, which is just a law of identity. As I was using the example of you before, uh, even the terms which law is law over are themselves independent in that they are distinct from the law itself. Hegel uses the example of positive and negative electricity. Their unification, which is proper to them, is the law. But nonetheless, the distinction between positive and negative is also necessary and independent uh, or distinct from the law itself. Uh, so, kind of just what I was talking about before about how there's a difference between something necessarily being itself, and that it is itself, and it being necessary in itself. Two very different, very very different claims. Uh, Hegel speaks of motion as law, which is taken as necessary, and he shows this necessity to be nothing but a sham. With motion, you have the other terms of existence: time, space, distance, velocity, and all of these are distinct because of this, they have some sort of independence, not in a pure sense, but in the sense that one is independent in that it is not the other. It is now that we see motion as law is not necessary, but it is the way in which these independent terms are related to one another. That is what motion is. Motion is not their essence, as their essence is many, and it's and distinct. And motion is rather the relation of the essences. Once again, motion is the understanding, elevating the relation to a universal as an in itself, and not yet understood as a for consciousness, as a notion. Basically, between time, space, velocity, distance, those three things, they have different essences. Each of them are self same, and obviously there's many of them. There's many self same essences. The motion which exists in between them is not their essence. It is not. It is a law. Sure, it's a law over them, but it's distinct from the essence of the things that it is law over. That's sort of what he's getting at. And you can't say motion is necessary for those things to exist. Those things are independent of motion as such.
What things?
Time, velocity, distance, and space.
Hmm.
Uh, so in order for motion to even exist, you have to have those things first. So, and of course, consciousness yet doesn't realize this. It doesn't even realize that all these abstractions are for itself. It's still sort of stuck there. Uh, so, 16. We got three more pages left. This one might be shorter than the last one, which will be good, I guess. So, force has a unity, but also a manifoldness proper to its nature. But the understanding seeks to resolve this contradiction by making this the essence of its existence. Force is itself the unity and the necessity of this is the law, but this necessity is itself synonymous with force. The manifoldness within force, or the difference, is said not to be a difference at all, but a necessity of force itself, and thus the manifoldness is led back to a unity. This is what Hegel calls the process of explanation, which is the act of the understanding positing the force as law, which is a unity. Hegel uses the example of lightning. Lightning is force, but because it exists across a plethora of expressions, there is a unity underlying, which is its law. And this law of force is taken to be a necessity and is treated the same way a logical necessity is treated. What all this necessity really is uh, is that the law is necessarily itself. Because force is this unity and self-same, and its moments pass into one another, making it force. It is said to be and the one and the understanding. Likewise says this is no different from law, which is its existence as a universal. It is a sham of the understanding of necessity because it's simply saying law is itself, whereas logical necessity would be saying that something must exist and can't be otherwise. Kind of what I was saying before. And I like the example of lightning. I guess it's a good way to make sense of it. Okay, so there's lightning. It exists, across a plethora of instances, and it's guided by some law, whatever law it is. And yes, it's true that that law is itself, and that that it's universal or whatever. But it doesn't have to exist. It's not, there's a conceivable world in which it doesn't exist.
What is the law? Is it conductivity,
Yeah, I guess it would be.
like the spread of electricity, like the
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm not like I said, I'm not good with
across like water droplets, I guess. Yeah.
but like so that itself, it's logically possible that that doesn't have to be the case. Um, so, but consciousness is treating it as if it is. And you know what? It's kind of funny because you see this all the time when you talk to like Reddit people. Uh, the way they treat like the laws of science as like this sort of like uh, this absolute thing that can never be.
Science is settled.
Yeah, well, they treat it as something that can never be like contradicted. Like I was speaking to this girl once about quantum physics, and she was like, "Well, did you know something can exist in two places at once?" I'm like, "No, it can't, unless it's like, I mean, in a way, yes, but like not in the way that you're positing. It can't like exist in the future. I don't know. It was like something retarded." And she was like, "Well, science says it can." I'm like, I don't care what science says. If it's positing something that's like self-contradictory, then it can't exist. I'm like that. Uh, so like, yeah, no, a physical object cannot exist in two places at the same time because there's a distinction there, and if they're distinct, they're not the same. So pretty clear that like people treat scientific quote unquote law the same way they would treat logical law, but all scientific law, this is not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I was arguing with this guy the other day. He was like, philosophy is a waste of time or whatever. Like science is better. I'm like, yeah, but like, hey,
But isn't it so? Like, to go back to the quantum physics thing? Sorry to interrupt, but like so like there is a conflict between logic and physics in that case, right?
yeah.
Or
But I would
is
say
it
like that's impossible. Like you're positing like you cannot posit self-contradictory things. And they'll be like, well, it's at a lower level. Like, what does that mean? Even like you can't
at
like
a
you can't.
lower, like a molecular, like atomic level, or what?
Well, they would say it's in like at a quantum level, as if that like gets
Uh,
around the problem. That's a subterfuge. It's a matter of subterfuge, or what the kids would call cope. You know, uh, like okay, but levels themselves already presuppose logic. What is a level? It's something that's self same, has its own identity. Uh, you know, and if you can have like if you can violate the law of non-contradiction, right? Okay, let's go with that for a second. Then I could just say that, well, like let's say something can be in two places at once, and that's true. And I can say, well, something can't be in two places at once, and that's true. But you can't deny that if you want to deny the law of non-contradiction. So you end up in like a sort of absurd thing. Uh, but like science tards do this all the time. So anytime someone argues with me about like philosophy versus science, which they aren't juxtaposed unless you make them juxtaposed, I'll just be like, hey, genius, everything in science, like everything you're positing, presupposes a whole set of like philosophical presuppositions. Uh, you know,
owned.
yeah. I'm sure the Jay Dyer crowd would be very happy to hear that argument that I just made. Very Jay Dyer-esque. But he's right. I mean, he didn't invent that style of argumentation. I think Cornelius Van Til did. Well, Aristotle has elements of presuppositional arguments, but I think presuppositionalism as a thing was created by uh, Calvinists. But Anyway, where was I? Uh,
You're talking about Jay Dyer.
yeah, no, I mean on the paragraph here. Consciousness now knows the distinction present in force is a distinction present for the understanding, and in its concrete expression, there is no distinction. Consciousness takes the unity of the play of forces as its own object, and this is flux itself. When consciousness tries to distinguish the law as necessary, this is purely tautological, which is to say, it simply tells us that the law is itself. We see also that the distinction between solicited and soliciting in force exists for the understanding, but it is cancelled when expressed in the supersensible world. Now, consciousness from knowing law begins to know flux itself, which is present in the supersensible world and can know and experience change there in the understanding. This this law of flux in the supersensible world draws distinctions where there don't seem to truly exist or are logically inexplicable. The selfsame object is repelled from itself in flux, but its inner being or essence remains the same. A concrete example is an apple. Here we go with this apple example again. Existing through time, remaining the same apple in essence, but distinct from its existence in moments of time. Yet these distinctions of its existence through flux, when analyzed, seem not to be distinct since they remain self-same, and likewise flux itself is self-same. Yet they are still distinct by moments, even though the moments themselves do not seem to have any quality distinct in themselves and are all equal as moments. That was a typo there. I'm clarifying that. Anyway, consciousness through its notional thinking creates a split between the moments, but the antithesis between them is truly none. Okay, so basically, now we've moved beyond law. We see that it's problematic, or law as such, rather, it's problematic. And to say it's, to describe it as some sort of logical necessity, really is just to say it is a mistake, or it's a tautological truth. We're just saying it is itself, obviously. We then begin to understand flux as a sort of thing underlying all of it. And, uh, and
And the next
it's,
thing you know is you tune out.
yeah, that's if you read Deleuze, which, we haven't done yet. But, uh, uh, the, I use here like the self same object is repelled from itself. The concrete example of this is like an apple sitting on a desk for like a day, or like a book sitting on the desk for a day. It's existing through a series of succession. It's moving in time. It's repelling itself from itself. It's this apple, this apple, this apple, like just ad infinitum basically. Um, and but it's weird. It seems to sort of be paradoxical because it's the same apple, but it's also existing in different instances of time, distinguishing itself from itself, and the flux itself is self-same, even though it's divided through a plethora of things that are distinct. So it is sort of like a weird, sort of contradictory world, which we'll, you know, we'll talk about that in a second here. Uh, let's see, did I finish this? Let's see.
So like the way you're describing it sounds like you're on drugs or something.
Yeah, I was when I first came across because like when I first did my first reading of this book, I was supplementing it with Gregory B. Sadler's videos, and some guy was like, "Man, I'm surprised Hegel didn't take acid." When he like, and then
Is this really the same apple in this moment from the next? Like,
well, and then like Gregory B. Sadler like replied adequately, and he's just like, "You don't need to take drugs to do this, man. This is just like doing logical thinking. Actually, drugs impair your ability to do that for the most part, unless they're like stimulants." But I really, yeah, that's why like when I do these philosophy videos, I need to like put out like right wing stuff because I don't want to attract like the wrong crowd when I put this stuff out. Uh, so and a bunch of like, I hate nerds. I really don't like nerds. Uh, So, and I know it's a little fresh for me to say that, but uh, it's the truth. I can't stand people who are like too dirty. You got to have a little bit of charisma to you and a little bit of outgoingness
a
in
little bit
life.
of je ne sais quoi, that
Yeah,
X factor,
some
as we
X
call it
factor.
in the
Uh,
sales business.
So consciousness, through its notional thinking, creates a split between the moments, but the antithesis between them is truly none. So basically, right. So like you have like this world of flux where everything is constantly distinguishing itself from itself. But the world of flux is one world. There is no distinction in that. Like there is distinctions, of course, but really the world is one. So the distinction is truly, in a certain sense, kind of subsumed within a unity. Is what he's saying. It's really not there in a way. Uh, so moving on here. And so when he says it's truly none, he obviously he's not denying that we experience the world in flux. He's just saying, well, no, like we're like the world is one, and this sort of like self-distinguishing, it appears as a very like a infinite plethora of different worlds, but it's not. It's one world moving, basically. Um,
Oh, like earlier you sounded like a BPD chick.
I know when I said the world is one, I caught myself saying that. And I like cringed, but I didn't know. I don't know how else to say it.
The
You know?
world, we are all one.
Yeah, I'm like, all right, well, like this is like the best way to phrase it. Basically, you know, I'm sure the girls with the septum piercings and the dream catcher thing on there. What is it like? These girls have like these like mandala, um, like blankets on their like over their bed. It's like the like hippie chicks are into
It's
that.
not even a real mandala. It's like the circular thing, which isn't even
Yeah,
real mandala. Like mandala, like real mandalas, like look different. They're like angular.
yeah, and like they
But
watch like 3 videos on Carl Jung and think they know everything now. Like what do you mean when I was 15? Get the fuck out of here. Anyway, um, so so here we're gonna this is an important part here. This is like another movement in the dialectic that we gotta really pay attention to. In the first supersensible world, which is consciousness's movement of raising sensuousness to a static world, which it can predicate uh, of them that its tranquil kingdom of law, which remains self same, much like the objects the laws move. However, once consciousness becomes acquainted with the law of flux or change, it understands that the nature of the supersensible world is to move, and this second notion of it is the inverted world. Inverted in the sense that it is no longer static, but it is moving, and the laws themselves are also repelling themselves from themselves, like the objects of the supersensible world. Certainly, the laws are universal as they exist in a manifold expression, but they are subject to the flux and movement itself, or just self-repelling. So
wait, so what did you mean when you said in the first super sensible? Oh, go back. In the
this,
first super sensible world, which is consciousness movement of raising sensuous to a static world, which can predicate of it, them creates the tranquil
yeah.
kingdom.
So
What do you
that's
mean by that?
so that's a bad typo, but I can I can like rephrase that. So basically, we get the super sensible world. Consciousness abstracts the world. And like I've said before, it says, "Oh, there's this world outside of myself. I can predicate of it laws, right? And these laws, this is the tranquil kingdom of laws. These laws don't move. They stay the same, but they are responsible for the movement within that super sensible world. So it has sort of an element of stasis in it, but also it accounts for the movement as well. But then this world becomes inverted once it understands that there's a flux underlying those laws as well, and much like how the objects are existing through time, repelling themselves from themselves, the particular laws are also repelling themselves from themselves. So the law of gravity, you know, uh, much like the computer in front of me right now, existed a second ago as it does now, and so on. It's within the sort of flux itself that's guiding the existence of all these particular things within the supersensible world. So that's the second supersensible world. It's recognizing that, oh, wait a second, there's actually something higher than those laws. It's flux itself, which
Whoa,
is
there's a second super sensible world. Whoa.
yeah. So like how you said before, throughout life we're building up the super sensible world. He's kind of saying that here. He's saying, "Oh, we're building up the super sensible world, and now we realize that not only are the objects subject to change and flux, so are the laws that we thought were responsible for its movement. The laws themselves are sort of as distinct particular beings as objects for our consciousness are also moved along with flux. So there's something higher outside of those laws." And like that's why for as a concrete example, gravity. That law is, it was the law a second ago, and it's now the law now, and it's the law of gravity now, and it's the law of gravity now, etc. Uh, it's subject to the movement of flux in existence, which means that flux is higher than it because flux is pushing it with itself. Uh, and that's the inverted world. Now, the second
Well, can
supersensory.
the law of gravity ever be undone
Well,
by flux?
I don't think so.
Then it's not truly subject to it, is it?
Well, it is subject to it in the way that like the apple is subject to it. It's by flux. It's not necessarily that flux changes the nature of those things or like destroys it. It's just that its existence and once like for example, the existence of the law of gravity yesterday, right, is the same as its existence today. But there's a distinction between today and yesterday, and that itself is flux, sort of behind it, making that distinction. Basically, is what I'm getting at. Just like how there's a distinction between the apple or the book on my desk between today and yesterday, and what distinguishes it is flux itself, even though the book is the same. It's the same in its qualities, but its existence, right, in today and yesterday is distinct. That's what he's saying. And he's saying that because that's the case, flux is beyond the law, these various laws responsible or present in the world of objects. Uh, and that's the inverted world. Now,
But
now
where is the distinction?
okay. So the distinction, right? It's the distinction is between. Well, that's the hard part, right? Because it's like, well, okay, the book is its qualities are the same, right? But it's just like obviously the book today is not the same thing as the book yesterday because their existence in today and yesterday are two different existences, right? Because today and yesterday are different. Uh, and that's sort of what he's getting at. And of course, like today I'm using today and yesterday because it makes it easier to grasp, but that applies to like milliseconds.
Moment.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, so and so that recognition that law is actually not as superior as we thought it was is now the inverted world. This world where like it's almost contradictory in a sense, where it's like, well, it's contradictory because kind of like how you pointed out, like, well, how can these things be different if their qualities are the same? But then I'm pointing out, well, hey, wait a second, they're distinguished between the moments that they exist within. So it's like this weird paradox. It's like it's the same thing, but it's also different at the same time. And uh how does like that's such a weird like consciousness is sort of like stuck there. Now, F.H. Bradley would say, yeah, and because of this,
So
you know,
the difference in time accounts for a total change in the essence of the object.
I wouldn't say the essence of the object, but its concrete existence, basically.
Mhm.
Because the qualities are still the same, of course, right? Like the red book on my desk is still red, but its concrete existence is not the same concrete existence as it was a moment ago, or yesterday, or last month, or tomorrow. So that's what he's getting at. But see that the fact that we can have the same qualities, it has this sort of self sameness, but at the same time is divided and distinguished from itself in those moments. So in some sense, it's not the same, even though it is the same to itself. Is this inverted?
I guess I'm having trouble like conflating time, like the passage of time, with the object itself.
Sure, but
I'm not like I'm having a hard time like conceptualizing how time is not separate from the object.
well, they're distinct, of course, right?
Because the object exists within time, of course, but it's not identical with
Right, and he's not saying that
time.
either. He's not saying that either, but like but clearly, like if you were to take the book on your desk, you could not say that the book on my desk is the same concrete existence as the book on my desk yesterday, right? Because yesterday and today are two concrete existences that are distinct from one another, even though the object within them, in terms of its qualities and its whatever, is they're the same. And even as a matter of fact, if we point to the time itself, the quality of both existing within time is the same. So even if we try to like, even in a weird way, you can't even use that as the distinguishing factor. But nonetheless, clearly they're distinct. Yesterday.
So say you had the book on a desk that was facing the window. You had the window open.
Yeah.
So one day it's like it's sunny weather. The next day it's rainy weather, and the rain gets in through the window, ruins the book, right? So is that an example of how like it's kind of like it's dependent on the passage of time, or like it's somehow dependent on like
Sure,
outside forces?
sure, yes, but you don't even need to go that far because like even if you had like the book on the window and the condition like every day was a sunny day for 10 years, uh, you know, it would still like there would still be a distinction between them because the moments are distinct. And but that so that's the inverted world. And the fact that you like are having a hard time conceptualizing it is kind of like proving Hegel's point in a way, because he's like, well, wait a second, we have like two things that are contradictory here. Uh and it's like consciousness doesn't like it's having a hard time dealing with it. So it's like it's has a sense of like, oh, these things are all self-same, but it clearly exists in this sort of moving thing that's distinguishing itself from itself. And it's an
But why
inverted.
does it matter?
Well, what do you mean? Why does it matter for
Like
like the
why does it matter, like the passage of time from moment to moment, if the book remains the same? Why does it make a difference?
well when you ask why, like why in relation to what though? Like why in relation to like our knowing of it, or
Why is it of consequence?
because in our experience and it means that there's a sort of self distinguishing going on, which is which is sort of implying that there is something else underneath all of these objects in existence, which is negativity, right? Which we sort of talked about in the preface. But uh, it's of significance because, or of consequence, because he's showing how from that principle, we're going to get to sort of the essence of reality being inherently self contradictory or paradoxical. Um,
But now you're talking about the object as it relates to consciousness rather than the object itself.
Well, but that's the whole. This book itself is about that. So, like,
Mm.
you know, the object's the object's quality stay the same. There's no that like that's part of this, and that's part of the problem. It's like the qualities of the object stay the same, but its existence through time is distinguishing itself from itself. But even in a weird way, even though we know that, even if I try to say, well, the time itself is the distinguishing factor. But wait a second, the time is also the same, right? Like the moments are all equally moments. So that also makes things blurry again. It's like you're constantly trying to poke at it, but you can't, even though you know it, right? Even though you know the book today is not the same thing as it was yesterday, even if all the qualities are the same, because yesterday and today aren't the same thing. But what's the difference between yesterday and today? Uh,
Yeah, but that's not how people like ordinarily think of
yeah, but Hegel
static
isn't.
object. It's like, like this book, I have this book, I've always owned this book.
Yeah,
You
because
know,
most people aren't, enlightened chuns. That's why.
right, right.
No, you're right though, right? Because like today, right? Like I didn't think like that when I went to work. Like I got my car, like this is the same car I've had for 2 years, and it'll be the same car tomorrow. But like when you do philosophy, you're going beneath the surface of day to day life. Uh, so
Yeah,
you know,
I guess that's part of why I asked you why this is of consequence.
yeah. I
Why
mean,
is
like,
it useful to think in this way?
well, this is like my dad asking me, like, so how does this make you money? Um, well, I
No,
mean,
but like even in philosophy, there has to be an application to concepts, right?
Yes. No, I mean, he's gonna get to that. And he's gonna say that from this we get to a sense of infinity, and that we understand that infinity, constant movement, is the essence of existence, and we can see that in everything. I mean, that's sort of what he was saying in the preface, and that'll later be reflected in absolute knowing, and that everything is moving.
Where do you get the notion of infinity from
Well,
the passage of
well,
time as it concerns
well,
an object?
well. If you'll just let me get to it, pal, I'll
Okay,
show you.
okay,
So
go on.
we got a couple pages left. We're almost there. Uh, So in the inverted world, the world of change, we see things turn into their opposite. But this turning into their opposite is a product of that which came before it. The movement in the inverted world is self-contained. In this paragraph, Hegel is alluding to the fact that things morph into something new, but this is done inherent to the nature of each thing, which has within itself the law of flux leading to change. So that's kind of what he's getting to here. And he uses interesting wording here. He says like things become the opposite of themselves. Uh, so it's like the book distinguishing itself from itself. In a sense, it is the opposite. Not in the sense like the book is like, well, what's the opposite of red? Is it green on the color scale? I don't know, but
Blue, I think.
blue. Yeah, sorry, I was retarded. Sorry, uh,
Yeah.
that should have been obvious. Anyway, but like even the book with all of its qualities remaining the same, being distinct in time, it is like it's othering itself from itself. It becomes like an opposite, so to speak. But opposite in quotations, it should be said, because there really is no true opposites. Because if
No,
you're
I think it's purple. Sorry.
okay, so really that's okay.
Or
I don't.
well, no. What do you mean by color scale? Because I mean, there's like the spectrum of light, visible light, and
I
it goes
just
from
mean like
infrared to ultraviolet.
I don't know. I'm not like a good artist, so I'm kind of just talking out of my ass.
Okay.
So I don't know. One time, some
Sorry,
girl
sorry,
told me
go on. What were you
she
saying
knew
earlier?
she knew about the color scale. I'm like, oh, that's really cool, but I didn't give a shit. Anyway,
Color scale.
um, so moving on, I'll just go on to the second paragraph here. The inverted world, which has present within this inherent nature of movement and paradox, has also within itself distinctions inherent to the inversion. But the distinctions are real and have identity in themselves. Hegel uses the example of black, which has for itself whiteness as its contrast. But this whiteness also has its own real existence and is not some shadow or phantom existence. In the case of bad action with good intent, the good intent is real just as much as the bad action associated with it is. Hegel here is putting an emphasis on how negativity must exist alongside positivity and needs it in order to operate. This principle is necessary for understanding Hegel's logic. So yeah, for example, like blackness cannot truly exist without whiteness. Uh, bad intent or sorry, bad action but with good intent cannot really exist without the good intent. Uh, Wherever there is a positive thing, there is its other, so to speak. But its other is not just like a phantom or something. It's necessarily associated with it. A really, I'll use the example X, right? So X, in order for X to exist, there must be some sort of understanding of not X because you have to be able to say X is not equal to not X because X is equal to X. Uh, that's inherent to the nature of X to have that sort of negativity, that otherness present in it. But that otherness is real. It's not just like some sort of like phantom. Some positivists
Black
or
out like a phantom.
yeah, yeah. Some positivists or nominalists will try to argue that, like, well, like I think like Deleuze or somebody, and I've came across people like this when I've sort of explained this system to them. They're like, well, negativity isn't real because you're pointing to nothing. It's like, no, I'm not pointing to nothing. I'm pointing to relations. And that's what Hegel is doing. He's saying like there is an otherness, a distinction. And if you deny the distinction, you end up collapsing the two into one another, and then everything is the same. Uh, so which that leads to a whole host of epistemological problems for the materialist because there has to be distinction between the units of matter. I won't get into that. That's beyond the scope of this project, but just thought I might as well throw it in there. Anyway, in the inverted world, wait, did I read? Yeah, okay. In the inverted world, the opposites contain the other in them, and in some sense, opposite is not the best word since they do contain otherness as a result of determinate negation. The inverted world, by its own nature, inverts itself, which is to say that since it is the world of change and opposite, it must also have inherent to it stable self-same identity, so that there can be change and that there can be opposite, since change requires a positive expression and an other or opposite. So too requires a relation between terms with distinct and independent existence. So that's this is actually a very small paragraph, but it's a very tricky one because when we say the inverted world by its own nature inverts itself, which is to say that since it is the world of change and opposite, it must also have inherent to it stable self same identity so that there can be change. So it's sort of what I was talking about before, like the inverted world, because its essence is to be inverted, it has to have inherent to it is sort of contradiction or paradox. Like okay, it is this world of flux and movement, but in order for flux and movement to exist, it has to invert itself. So it needs to have stability within it to go beyond it. You can kind of see this with Aristotle too, where he talks about like order and chaos. He's like, if you talk about chaos, you're necessarily implying order, because chaos itself as an identity is a stable identity that is self same, and that's order. You're implying order and you know logic there. So it's sort of a similar thing that Hegel's getting at here. And that's also another sort of, I guess, uh, overlap with Aristotelian philosophy that we kind of talked about last time. So that's sort of that's kind of the gist of what he's saying there. Through the process of this infinite movement, law expresses.
So all order is chaotic and all chaos is orderly.
Yeah, basically. Um, because order has distinction within itself, which is some kind of chaos, but chaos itself has a unity to itself, which is order. So those two things go hand in hand. Um, so through the process, and this is why people like try to associate Hegel, I think, with like Hermeticism or something, because he's like,
Yeah, like order out of chaos,
yeah.
occultism, bro.
And I hate that stuff, by the way, because I've met some people who try to. I'm like, can you just read the guy, please? Like, just read the guy, and he's talking about like the movement of unity and multiplicity. He's talking about like he's not here to like do some like weird like demon worship or something. You know, I don't know.
Or
It's
like
low IQ.
Julius Evola.
Yeah, it's like low IQ stuff anyway that people try to get into, and I can't stand that kind of
Have
stuff.
you read Evola's book on theosophy?
Yeah, yeah, it was great. It doesn't.
Sorry, I meant Evola's book on Hermeticism.
I know I haven't. I've only read like the Evola. I've read the Metaphysics of War. Was the first one I read. That's the one I did a book report about in 11th grade. A couple years before I started this channel, I read Revolt Against the Modern World. I think I've read some sections of Ride the Tiger, and I really don't want to read him. I think he's kind of a waste of time. He's fun to read. Don't get me wrong, but like, what am I going to get from, you know, it's a little clearly,
It's a survival manual for the aristocrats of the soul.
yeah, the aristocrats of the soul. It was my unmade bed and my laundry that hasn't been done in 3 weeks. Anyway, um, uh, through the process of infinite movement, a law expresses itself in an immanent reality. Within it expresses itself through time, but in doing so, it remains self-same. Force repels the self-same objects from itself, and the moments themselves do this as well. But this reality expresses itself as a single existence which is taken as the supersensible world, and within it, the understanding finds distinctions which exist as self-same independent identities, but are necessarily related. They are related to one another and manifest as a unity, where the distinctions do not show themselves outright, but exist in the inner world of the understanding. The universal qualia of red as such is not present in the apple, but it is inferred in the understanding. We've talked about that plenty of times already. Uh, However, this difference is really no difference at all in the sense that in their concrete existence, they exist as a unity. Hegel uses the example of time, space, distance, and velocity, which he also used before. Uh, these universals exist separate from one another, but in their real and concrete existence in the supersensible, they exist as a unity. This is the same principle we saw in the perception of the object's essential and unessential aspects, where the universals uh, that are independent but do not interpenetrate the object show themselves to be a distinction of the understanding, whereas the object itself is a determined unity. However, we do not come to know that the universals are real and do matter, but well, we do come to know that the universals are real and do matter, but do so for the understanding. So,
Oh, is this the last page?
nope, we got one more after this, but it was
Oh, okay.
yeah, we're almost done. We're almost done. I promise.
Slug it out.
Yeah, we're getting there. Uh, so this is going to be the answer to your question though from before. We're coming to the end of this section.
Oh, nice.
Hegel now arrives at the conclusion of true infinity. True infinity is an infinity which is not a mere movement of moments away from themselves. Rather, it is a self-same and self-relating infinity. Its moments are its dividedness and are for themselves. The distinction within the infinite is its essence, and its supersession is a self-supersession. Every move away from one manifestation of itself is a move toward another manifestation of itself. To be infinite is to be self contained, as for anything other to contain As for anything other to contain it, would make it finite. The infinite is moving, yet it is also at rest, in the sense that its essence is self relating through the transcendence of its own forms, yet it is transcending these forms only toward itself, which is what remains at rest, or better put, self same. Hegel makes a subtle yet important claim toward the end of paragraph 162. The unity is abstracted from the divided or manifold experience of infinity, but this is not an objection to the unity of the infinite, rather, it reinforces it. It reinforces it because to draw unity from manifoldness proves that they are necessarily related and distinct from one another, yet share existence for their distinction, which is, of course, this unity. The manifold nature itself shows there is a contradiction within it, and that contradiction is the manifoldness within unity. The manifoldness thus becomes known as such in the unity, and the unity becomes known through the manifoldness or distinction. One requires the other, as we saw in the inverted world. It contains the other not as some shadow, but as having real essence or inner being. Each distinct object is an opposite of the other, or quote, opposite of the other, but in some sense, as Hegel notes, these are not opposites, but true otherness, with equal being as their counterpart.
How does this
Basic.
answer my question?
Well, we still got 3 paragraphs left.
Oh, okay.
So, but basically, just to sort of sum that up a little bit, within true infinity, you have it's a self-contained infinity. It's transcending itself, its own expressions. But someone blowing up your.
Oh no, it's just me uh doing an exasperated sigh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Uh, it's a self-superseding sort of infinity, and within it is a manifoldness, of course, because that's necessary for its self-supersession. But this manifoldness doesn't detract from its unity. In fact, it reinforces it because its unity can only exist by virtue of its manifold uh, sort of expressions through which the unity is a unity of. That's what he's getting at. And I have a thread on Twitter for anybody interested. You can go to my account. I do compare Hegel's complete infinity to Heraclitus's sort of underdeveloped infinity. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. I just thought it was something cool. But it is through the act of explanation of forces which turn into law for the understanding that we see the distinction between law and force lacks content in the sense the former is merely the tautological framing of the latter. The various laws, which are the understanding derives from its abstraction of forces, is the basic, or sorry, is the basis for the law, the gener that of the generation for the generation of self consciousness. The act of explanation of forces is consciousness talking to itself. Once consciousness understands force, it begins to understand law, the plethora of forces distinct from force as such. But after this, it begins to make a difference between force and law, which after some time it realizes is no difference at all. It does this through knowing that since a difference has been made between force and law, that each has their unity, but their difference lacks content. Thus, as force is a unity, consciousness makes its way back to a fuller understanding of force as such by virtue of its manifold expression in law, the passage toward true infinity. And the difference between it and law, which it had made, reveals they become one. But because all this exists as the object of knowing for the understanding, and it is the understanding speaking to itself for itself, it is what self consciousness is. So,
So it sounded like earlier Hegel was saying might is right.
where did you get that?
Well, when he
Okay.
identified force with law.
Well, yeah, I mean, like if you read Siege just before you read this, maybe that's the interpretation you'd have. But yeah, but
What
basically,
is
so
the interpret? Is that not the correct interpretation?
no, he's not saying mine is right.
No, but like
He's
when he says force and law are the same, that's kind of the implication, isn't it?
well, yeah. If you like, well,
Force is
clearly,
law, might is right. It's synonymous, right?
well, I'm calling up Jay Dyer, and he's on the phone, and he's telling me you're making a word concept fallacy right
Oh
now.
my goodness.
So the word and the concept aren't necessarily univocal, buddy. Um, I just said I hated nerds like a minute ago, and like only a nerd would know this shit. So whatever. Little embarrassing, I guess. But but this is actually a very important paragraph too, because he's saying that like through the process of explanation of consciousness reasoning through this to itself, and understanding that it's coming. Like, for example, when consciousness is explaining its own understanding of these things to itself, that's the beginning of self-consciousness. It's not fully self-consciousness, but it's basically laying out the sort of preconditions for it. Uh, it doesn't yet understand that it's explaining itself is for itself, though. That's where self-consciousness comes in later on, which is the next section after sense certainty. Anyway, last two paragraphs. Consciousness' experience of infinity is a mere happening, but eventually, as we have seen, is raised to the level of the notion where consciousness begins to understand the unity of the paradox of like becoming unlike, and the repelled becoming the repelling. The distinction within this unity is for consciousness, but not really in how it expresses itself concretely. Although distinction is present, it does not appear as a unity until the understanding abstracts it as such. Eventually, self-consciousness begins to form, where the nature of this true infinity is likewise reflected in consciousness when it becomes its own object. For example, I repel myself from myself and become my own object. Yet this distinction only exists for me and not for consciousness in itself. In the act of distinguishing myself from myself, it is known that since the object it only is my object, it is not distinct from me. Likewise, the same can be said for all the previous shapes of the understanding. All of the distinctions of objects are really consciousness. Self-consciousness does not yet know this as of now. The distinction of ourselves from ourselves is just the knowledge of ourselves, but not of self-consciousness. There's a difference between knowing yourself and knowing that you know yourself as yourself, is basically what he's saying.
What does it mean to distinguish yourself from yourself?
So, for example, you can think of yourself as like a person that's like, okay, uh, when you think of your time in school as a little boy, you're you're distinguishing yourself from yourself in that process because the conception of yourself is not the same thing as you as a concrete existing thing. But nonetheless, that conception is really just it only exists within you. It does ultimately refer to something concrete, but like the actual that's a pure object of consciousness at the end of the day, in a way, because it's really just you. It's really just this sort of
Well, I mean, you don't even have to like go back in time
yeah.
to your younger self. Like it's just like the idea that you have of yourself, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I was just doing that to make it really easy, but yeah, that's really what he's getting at here, where he says, uh, "I repel myself from my." Well, this is me paraphrasing. I repel myself from myself and becoming my own object. Yet this distinction only exists for me and not for consciousness in itself. So what is so this is like a little bit of a tricky line. It only exists for me and not for consciousness in itself. Basically, he's saying that consciousness in itself isn't bifurcated like that. It's a sort of a distinction made within the understanding in our own conception, but it's not like a real
So
distinction
there's
of.
a difference between your consciousness and your mind.
Well, no, he's saying there's a distinction between your consciousness and like its thoughts, pretty much, because consciousness transcends every particular thought, even though it's
Yeah.
intimately tied with one. Uh, and that's why he said, there's a difference between why I said there's a difference between knowing yourself and knowing that you know yourself as yourself. Uh, so, basically you can sort of say, oh yeah, like that's me, right? But then you can say, well, I know that's me. That's more self-consciousness in a
I
way.
believe that's what we call metacognition.
Yeah. Well, and that's also metacognition. Yeah. Uh, Hegel ends this section by saying that consciousness moves from perception to the understanding, in which it understands the universal's underlying appearance, and thus eventually begins to understand appearance as it is for consciousness. In doing this, it begins to have a semblance of understanding of self consciousness, as it now knows that something is underlying appearance, and this whole time, that which was underlying appearance was actually what will be known later on as self consciousness. It begins to understand that the distinctions it makes are not truly different and are self-contained. This is the truth of self-consciousness that is underlying appearance. It begins to understand the difference between it itself and for itself, but also the itself being self-consciousness in the latter. Here, Hegel alludes to the next phase, which obviously we didn't get to because this is the first. But what I want to talk about there is, ultimately consciousness. Well, I really think it can be said here, best. Self consciousness does not yet realize, does not yet know this. Sorry, what am I saying here? Self conscious does not know this yet. As of now, the distinction of ourselves from ourselves is just a knowledge of ourselves, but not self consciousness. So that's I think that's really important. There's sort of like an identity, like, okay, well, I am this thing in relation to the world, which is like that's clearly a precondition for self-consciousness. But then there's going to be like and I can't say this with full confidence yet, but I do think he's probably going to say, well, there is, self-consciousness as, oh, I am my own object, but my object is also distinct from myself as such. And I think that is sort of the beginning of knowing self-consciousness. So with that said, that's another episode in the books. Probably see you guys next month.
I am my own object, but that object is distinct from myself. Is that what you said?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like, I don't understand that. Can you explain that to me?
So okay, um, so you have, as a conscious thinking agent, you have thoughts, right? You could just reason through things in your head. You could have dreams, right? But those things are not synonymous with your consciousness in itself, because consciousness in itself transcends those things. But the knowledge of consciousness transcending those things, and even the fact that you know that that knowledge itself is your own knowledge, is self-consciousness, or at least the beginning of it. Does that make sense, or do I sound like I'm a crazy person?
No, well, okay. Well, I suppose, yeah, I have the beginnings of understanding in regards to this.
Yeah, and I think, uh, because it's a little hazy how he gets from like the notion of infinity to that. But like
Yeah,
basically,
like that seemed to come out of nowhere.
yeah, and so I just want to quickly go over that, and then I'll end this. Basically, he's saying once consciousness begins to know that infinity and these forces exist for itself, and it starts to reason through these
But
things.
where do you get infinity?
Where does he get infinity from? Is what you're
Yeah,
asking. From
yeah. Like,
flux.
at what stage is it introduced?
Well, it's comes after. So there's law, right? And then we understand that law, when we consciousness tries to understand law through law as such, we find that that's sort of problematic, and that it's really flux that's underlying all this. But then once we understand flux, we understand that the world is inverted, and then once we understand the inverted world, that's the second supersensible world.
Inverted from what?
Well, inverted from it's inverted in the sense that like our first conception of the supersensible world was like the sort of like static world of the tranquil kingdom with things moving within it, but guided by laws that were static. But then we realized that those laws themselves exist within flux. But then once we have an understanding of flux,
So how do we realize the laws are in flux? Sorry, I just want to go through this in detail.
yeah, well, we understand the laws are in flux because we understand that the laws, like how I was explaining before, the law of gravity exists in time just as much as the objects around us do, right? So like uh, the law of gravity is still the law of gravity as it was a second ago, as it is now, and so on throughout moments. And we see that the
Even though it
moment,
can't really be undone.
yeah, but whether or not it's undone, it's not really relevant though. It's existing in it's existing in a manner which is repelling itself from itself, so to speak. It's the law of gravity today,
How's it repelling itself from itself?
just like the red book on the table is distinct between all the moments in which it exists. So is the law of gravity, uh, even though the qualities stay the same. But it's moments that it exists within are distinguishing themselves, and that's what he means by the object is repelling itself from itself, right? Because the
But
object,
see, like, this is really what I'm having difficulty with, is like this the conflation of time with the object.
well, so the object, right? He's not saying the qualities are different. That's not really what he's getting at.
Yeah, yeah. That, I mean,
Yeah.
like, so there's a difference between the quality and the object itself, which is identified with what?
Well, so the qualities are the properties of the object. But what he's trying to say is that like clearly the object, the book on my desk a moment ago is even though it's the same in every way, is distinct just by the fact that it now exists in a later in the next moment and then in the next moment. Now I know that's where you're sort of having a
Yeah,
different,
how is that the case?
because the object cannot be separated from the moment in which it exists. Uh, it's imminently tied with that. That's how the world around us works.
It's tied with it, or is it identical with it?
It's tied with it. It's
So it's
inherently.
not identical with it.
It's
It's
not
separate.
identical with it. Yeah, and but the thing is, you distinguishing that from time or whatever, that's your understanding, right? That's the sort of the level of the understanding, distinguishing these things into consciousness, which is not, it's not wrong to do that. But when we actually come back to concrete reality, we see, well, wait a second, these things are actually in a unity, right? They're in a unity with the world around it. It's not separate from
They're
it.
in a unity which merges it and obliterates the identity of the object, or is it rather distinct, like coexistence?
Well, it obliterates the identity of the object insofar as like the book on the table a moment ago is not the same book on the table it is now, because there is a distinction between a moment ago and now, and the book also exists in between within that distinction, right? So you can relate the two books in that sense. Now, in a sense, the book has divided itself, even though we take it to be the same book, because in our existence, uh, well, when we bring it into consciousness, we sort of put it into static form. But the way in which experience occurs, it's almost inverted in a sense, because clearly we take the book to be the same book, right? Even though it's distinguishing itself in a sense, and that's also why the world is inverted, because it's things remain the same, but are also not the same in a weird way, uh, right? So
Yes, but you don't pick up the book from the table and go, here's a new book that I never had before.
correct,
This is a new
correct,
book.
correct. You don't do that, right? Because that's consciousness treats the world as a unified thing, right? Because it exists as a unity. But when we sort of break the world down and analyze it, we see that it falls into this weird sort of self-distinguishing thing of flux. Uh, like Heraclitus says, you never step in the same river twice. Uh, that kind of thing.
Yes, but like it's not an exact analogy because like the river is constantly flowing and the book is static.
Well, no, the book isn't static though. Like the book is also constantly flowing in the sense that its existence is distinguishing itself in time. You can't take the book out of time.
How is it distinguishing itself in time?
Because the book of now is not the same thing as the book of then, right? And
How is it not the same?
well, because now and then are different. Which now and then,
But now you're switching back to time. You're not focusing on the object anymore.
I'm getting to that, because the object is, as I said, imminently tied with time. You cannot separate it from it. When you do
What
separate
is the
it,
nature of this relationship? How does time affect the object?
well, it affects the object in that it exists. The object is imminently one with it. To be the object is to exist in time, right?
But what is the fruit of that relationship between time and the
What do you
object?
mean? What is the fruit?
Like what is the consequence? What is the consequence of the relationship? Like how
Well,
does this
well,
like how is this observed, or like how is this demonstrated?
well, it's demonstrated by the fact that, when you say observe, that's a little bit of a difficult.
Okay, how is it demonstrated? Like how do we realize that this is the case?
Well, you realize this is the case because you, as a conscious observer, also exist through time, right? You know, uh, and you can, and even in the act of forming a sentence, there's a flow and a distinction in the act of speaking, right? Because that's the universal thing throughout the world, throughout existence. Um, and so the act of taking the book as a static thing, right? It's not inherently wrong to do that. You're doing that because the understanding is sort of abstracting it and distinguishing itself from the things that it's imminently tied with. But in reality, that's not how it works. In reality, it's imminently one with flux.
I feel like you're just going around in circles, bro. I don't
Well,
know.
I mean, I am, but we're both going around in circles here because I can only give you the same answer to the same question.
I guess I'm just not satisfied with your explanation.
Well, I mean, but you're asking like how is the object like? Of course, the object is not the same thing as time, but like even if you compare time to itself, right? Like the moments are both in terms of qualities the same. But nonetheless, they do distinguish themselves from each other, right? And to deny that would, of course, be contrary
The
to.
the only way in which I can conceptualize time as affecting the object is if it makes the qualities change, even if it's in an imperceptible sort of way, right?
Okay, but like, let me ask you something. Can you like, do you think like, do you not understand that like the the laptop on your desk right now is even though it's the same laptop, it is you cannot say it's the same laptop yesterday as it is today because yesterday and today are different and they're existing in
Yeah,
two
and the
different.
way I conceptualize that it not being the same is because like the effect of time on the object makes it change.
Sure, but the object it cannot be taken outside of time. It's one with time. It's like saying, like empty space. That doesn't really make sense as a concept. There's no such thing as empty space. There's just space. What we call empty space is merely just a relation, or the space between two spaces. But that's not empty space. That's still space. So it's you're making a distinction where there is none, or rather, you're making a not a distinction where there is none, but well, in the case of space, you would be, but you're sort of, um, like, actually, yeah, no, you are making a distinction where there is none, in a way. I mean, even though you're probably thinking I'm doing that, but or Hegel's doing that. Well, I guess we both are in your view, but uh, yeah, clearly, like you cannot separate the object from its imminent existence, and that's what Hegel's saying. You can do that in the understanding. Of course, you can say that, like, yeah, the red book is not the same thing as space itself. But even with the object, right? You do run into a problem because, well, what is the object? And this is what we saw at the beginning of sense certainty. Well, it's red, it's hard, it's whatever. It's all these qualities, but those qualities are not the same thing as the whatever the object is. And even if you take all the qualities together, that doesn't give us the object, right? Like the red book, right? If I divide it into a bunch of different things, okay, it's red, it's hard, it's white, uh, it has black letters in it, it has letters. Okay. Uh, but if I take all of those qualities and like say, okay, but that doesn't like merely putting those words together doesn't actually explain or give us an object. The only way we can get the object is by simply referring to concrete existence. And when we refer to concrete existence, what else do we refer to? Time, because time is imminently tied with concrete existence. Now, from that, we get flux. And flux then leads us to law, which then leads us to understanding law as part of that flux, and then the understanding begins to relate these things, explains it to itself, gets a sense of true infinity, but then it understands that it is related those things for itself, and then we get the beginning of self-consciousness, which is going to come next. So
Okay, well, I suppose we can revisit the book on the table later,
yeah,
because I think that is kind of like a strange unresolved issue that we seem to have developed. So maybe we
what
can discuss this
the
later.
time thing? Yeah, well, we'll have to. I think you and I will have to sort of talk about the relation of concrete and abstract to make that clear, because I think that's the root of the issue. So
Mm.
anyway, I'll end it here, and this will go up soon.